of the downsides of being in the pits of lockdown a number of months ago was that all sport had been cancelled. If you're a big football fan like me, you'd have taken this particularly hard, as there was no football to watch on the TV, or at the very least, no live football to watch on the TV. What many of the TV channels resorted to doing was showing old reruns of old classic football matches, but it's never quite the same, sure it's not. It's always better to watch sport live. For example, if you're a Man United fan, you don't quite get the same thrill watching an old classic of you beating Liverpool 2-1 many years ago. You don't get the same thrill because it's not live. You already know what's going to happen. The outcome is already fixed. You know it's going to end 2-1, and so when your players maybe make a bad decision, maybe get sent off or concede a goal, you don't panic. But when you were watching it live, maybe 5-10 years ago, you would be in disarray. You'd be screaming at the TV. It's an altogether different experience when you watch it live as to when you watch a rerun of a match that happened many years ago. Why? Because when the outcome is fixed, there's no need to panic. And while having an outcome which is secure might be a frustrating thing when you're watching your football match, it's actually an encouraging thing when we think about our lives. As we see sin and chaos and corruption around us, it's encouraging to know that God's final plans and outcome for our world are fixed in the future and they cannot be affected. And that's the feelings we get as we approach 1 Kings chapter 12, because the previous chapter we just read in chapter 11 was filled with sin and disobedience and evil and rebellion, and so as you come to chapter 12 you might think to yourself there's much reason to panic. But actually what previous chapters of 1 Kings have taught us is that actually there's not reason to panic, because God's outcome is fixed. God is using in His sovereignty and in His providence even the actions of sinful people to bring about His perfect will and His fixed purposes. In the last chapter we saw how God issued a judgment on both Solomon and Israel because of their disobedience. And part of that judgment on Solomon was that the kingdom of Israel would be removed from his line. You might recall even in the last chapter we saw the individual who would take the kingdom from Solomon, and it's a guy called Jeroboam. Notice how this plays out in chapter 12 of 1 Kings. This passage can really be broken down into three movements. Notice the first movement in verses 1 to 11, a foolish king. Foolish king. King Solomon, you might recall, died at the end of chapter 11, and now his son Rehoboam is taking his place and stepping up to the throne of Israel. But it's a bit of a bumpy start for Rehoboam. We discover that the people of Israel are pretty upset at the level of tax they have to pay. And so Rehoboam seeks some counsel. He goes to a number of older, wiser men and asks them what he should do. And these older, wiser men, well, they counsel Rehoboam and say, well, the people of Israel, they kind of have a point. We would counsel you to appease the people of Israel and lower the taxes for them. But it appears that this perhaps just isn't the news that Rehoboam wants to hear, and so he actually goes and seeks the counsel of other men, younger men. And these men kind of stroke Rehoboam's ego. They say to him, how dare the people of Israel question you? Do you know who you are? You're the king. In fact, here's what you should do. Show them who's boss, raise the taxes even more. And Rehoboam quite foolishly follows the advice of the younger council members, and he raises the taxes. And this shows us our second movement in the passage in verses 12 to 24, which is an angry revolt. The people of Israel, as you can imagine, weren't too happy with King Rehoboam and making this decision, and so if you look at verse 16 you can see that they all start protesting. Rehoboam attempts to try and calm things down, and so he sends one of his messengers to try and cool the air, and look what happens in verse 18. The people actually are so angry they stone him to death. Rehoboam flees at this point to Jerusalem, probably fearing for his life. And this angry mob of people in Israel hear that Jeroboam has returned to their land, and so they make a campaign to try and get Jeroboam to become their new king. Surprised? Well, you shouldn't be, because remember in the very last chapter, this is exactly what God promised would happen through the prophet Ahijah. And just as God said, this man Jeroboam took 10 of the 12 tribes. And so we see a foolish king, an angry revolt. Thirdly and finally then, notice an unfaithful nation, verses 25 to 33. So Jeroboam is now in charge of the 10 tribes in the north. Rehoboam is in charge of the 2 tribes in the south. And Jeroboam, who's in charge of the northern tribes, becomes a little bit concerned. He's concerned because he knows that the temple, where people are meant to meet and worship God, is in the south. It's in Jerusalem. And so the people in the northern 10 tribes would have to travel down to the southern 2 tribes in order to go to the temple and make sacrifices. You might appreciate why Jeroboam would be concerned by this. He's worried that as people enter Rehoboam's territory, they might be tempted once again to honour him as their king. And so his way of countering that is to make pagan shrines in the northern 10 tribes of Israel for the people to worship. Again, violating God's law by creating an alternative temple and thus leading the people of Israel into further and deeper and worse sin. What could possibly go wrong in chapter 12 of 1 Kings? Well, apparently everything. Yet isn't it encouraging to know that God can use all these sinful actions of wicked men to ultimately bring about his purposes? And you know, this isn't just true in the day of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, this is equally true in our day. It's easy to be overwhelmed with the panic when we see sin, which is flagged right in front of us, and violence on the streets, and violence in our neighbourhoods, and trauma on their TV screens. Yet it's encouraging to know that God's sovereignty extends to the four corners of our earth. Not one element of our world at any given moment somehow compromises the providence of God. He is bringing all things together to fulfill his ultimate purposes.